Our guest today is Dr. Tomasz Hollanek, an assistant research professor at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, now part of Cambridge's Institute of Technology and Humanity, and an affiliated lecturer in computer science and technology at the University of Cambridge. Tomasz joins us today from a very, very hot Paris, so thank you for joining us in a non-air conditioned room. I really appreciate it. It was interesting when I was putting together questions for Tomasz. He very much covered a lot of different areas. So I think the easiest way for me to understand it was to think about his focus on the intersection of AI ethics and critical design. His research that I've had fascinating on grief bots and postmortem AI avatars. It's been covered by many, many media outlets, New York Times, Guardian, BBC, lots of different places. And he shares Caping, a cross-sector policy group developing guidelines for socially beneficial AI companions. There's a huge amount I want to cover. We won't get to all of that. I appreciate that. So I'll just dive in if that's okay. So maybe the hardest question to start off with, really. But what drew you to work at the intersection of design theory and AI ethics? It's a relatively unusual pairing. So I'm just curious what the route into that looked like for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on the podcast, Andrew. And yeah, so how did I get into critical design and AI ethics? I think the best way to respond to this would be to actually go back to what I did before doing my PhD and later starting to work as a researcher at Cambridge. My original academic background is very much in the humanities. I studied literature, philosophy, cultural studies, media theory. At the same time, I at some point during my undergrad, I started working at a technology company, first in marketing, and then transitioned to user experience design and user experience research. And you know what happened at some point was that the theories and takes on on culture, on society that I was exposed to through my studies started to frame my own experience of working at a technology company. And so I don't see, this as an actual transition from the humanities to technology. I see this as a very coherent continuation, actually. So essentially, the roots of my work it all comes back to thinking about how we can apply humanities insights to the way we both understand, but also eventually how we design different technologies. And so and I think this is a good way to explain what AI ethics and critical design is to me. AI ethics, broadly speaking, we could define as a field of study that looks into the social, political, moral, environmental, also consequences of developing artificial intelligence, and perhaps also a way of outlining new values, new objectives for that development. And critical design is a very specific tradition of thinking about how we could be designing in more critical ways. Critical both in the sense of how do we make designers more critical of what they're doing and why they're doing it, but also in the sense of making users of technologies more critical of how they use these technologies, how they engage with them. So that's I think roughly how I would explain it. Basically, AI ethics is in some sense a theory of what it is that we want from the world with technology, and critical design is my way of thinking about how we can translate that theory into actual practice.
I guess one of the challenges with critical, or maybe in other words, sort of thoughtful design comes in the face of what's an increasing commercial entity. Remember, I
Sure.
talked to somebody from Google DeepMind years ago, and they said, "Oh, we've developed this amazing technology. We really see it being very much focused on medicine and on research, and it might have a commercial application at some point, but we're really focused on it. AI cure cancer. That was a big thing there." Then OpenAI launched their product, and suddenly Google thinks we've got this big product here. We can't lose market share. We've got to go and sell. So then the this is not a negative towards the AI companies, but when you have a commercial target, you've got to release Opus 4.6 or Sonnet 4.5 or OpenAI 3.6, 9.7, etc., etc. Does that? How does that commercial need to keep progressing bump up against a sort of critical design or more thoughtful design? Does that get put to one side in your view?
I don't think you can solve capitalism or the issues of neoliberalism with any new or old approach to design. But I think what critical design does do or aims to do is make designers more aware of how specific decisions that they make both stem from actually these systemic entanglements. So we could be thinking about the economy, politics. So making them more aware of how and where they sit within these broader systems of power relations, really, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also about making them more aware of the less immediate consequences of what it is that they're doing. So this could be, for instance, encouraging to think not only about the impact a specific technology has only on direct users of that technology, but also on wider community groups, society, and perhaps even broader environments. So thinking beyond the impact on humans alone. So long story short, I don't think I don't think critical design is a tool that can help us resolve these very deep and these fundamental tensions between corporate objectives and some ethical principles. But what it can do, I think, is provide a sense of orientation to designers that is more clearly articulated. For some of us, it's very obvious that some of the issues that we talk about when we talk about AI ethics are quite obvious, but not all of them are as obvious as we seem to believe within the AI ethics community when we speak with designers who work, for instance, for smaller startups, where there are different kinds of pressures. So, in many ways, my work doesn't necessarily focus on how we can reform Google. Actually, it is how we can empower smaller entities, smaller companies to both grow, because we do need new tools, new interventions, but grow in a way that is actually more self-reflective, more critical, and more empowering when it comes to the end users. And I mean, I can give examples later on, especially when it comes to grief bots. I've seen
Yeah.
very positive impact actually of the kinds of stuff that we're proposing that encourage providers of technologies to be more critical of what they're doing by making them aware of some systemic aspects of their work that they might not have been aware of when they actually decided to work in a specific area.
Is it and I'll paraphrase a little bit what you said, so forgive me, but you sort of said, so critical design is very much about the designers thinking more mindfully and thinking, like, say, more broadly, more deeply about the impact their design decisions have on the output of the product they're creating. But you also mentioned the potential impact that has on the end user of the product. And I guess I was just sort of thinking for a second there, and I guess that's similar in a way to when, 30 years ago, maybe even before, people didn't think about organic food or didn't think about battery farmed hens, didn't think about free range hens, but they still want the same product. Actually, they're thinking more mindfully about the choices they make and what they choose to buy to eat. So are you hopeful that we'll see people perhaps using AI more mindfully and we talked before we hit record about the terrible temperatures we're seeing now. We know AI uses a
Yeah.
lot of electricity, uses a lot of water, all of those things. So you think we'll see people move away from creating funny memes with AI to using AI for more purposeful outcomes?
I feel criticality, the way I understand it, is not about literacy, making people aware of how they can use tools or how they shouldn't be using certain tools. It's about empowering them to make the right choices,
Yeah.
but also to fight any wrongs that are done to them by AI systems. So criticality, the way I understand it, is the way I understand it is not something you can disentangle from this question of how do we empower people, and when we were thinking about empowering people, again, we cannot be really thinking only about individual users, but we have to think about communities, bigger groups, solidarity movements. So. In other words, the way I think about critical design is not a way of essentially making individuals users responsible for, you know, responsible choices that they should be making while using certain technologies. It's about thinking of ways in which we can expand the menu of options available to them in a way that they can actually do what it is that they want to do with these technologies. And very often we use technologies because we're sort of forced to. There is no other way around that. For instance, when our employer decides to use a specific suite of products, or when we know if we want to have access to certain type of information, we need to agree to certain types of privacy policies, for instance. And I think it's just so again, I would say it's not about individual responsibility, but it's about empowerment, including group empowerment, and encouraging solidarity as the very foundation for desirable technological development.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the point about we are often forced to use technology without necessarily an input from ourselves. So I lost my phone recently and went to go onto my banking app on a new phone before the number transferred across. And the banking app, we worked fine, but the banking app said, right, we'll now text you or call you on the number you've left us. So, but no, that's the phone that I've lost. And I had to physically go into the bank to get it. No, we've got to phone. No, we can't go. That's the number you gave us. Yes, but I've lost that number. I've lost that phone. It was just sort of circular discussion about the computer literally was saying no. Well, one of the things you mentioned there, and one of the things I really enjoyed reading in your research was your work on grief bots and postmortem avatars. I think many people have an understanding, but how would you define what a grief bot is? And I know it's asking you to almost do the impossible, but what did your research show about the use of grief bots?
So, grief bots, also known as deadbots, deathbots, postmortem avatars, are essentially AI-enabled simulations of deceased individuals produced with text, images, recordings of the deceased person to essentially used in a way to sort of allow the model to mimic this person's behavior, their speech patterns, their voice, etc. And these names, although I mean fundamentally they point to the same kind of technology, AI enabled simulations of deceased individuals, they kind of imply different uses actually. So I prefer to refer I usually refer to them as dead bots because what they share is that they do represent deceased individuals. Grief bots, this name comes really from the fact that sometimes the idea is that these systems can be used in grieving contexts. But that's not the only use case, and we can think of other, for instance, representations of historical public figures as an educational tool, or we could be thinking, we could also be pointing to a growing. Essentially, when we think of dead bots or grief bots, we can point to two major trends within the industry right now. On the one hand, providing tools that enable individuals to reconnect with their deceased loved ones. And on the other hand, we have tools that enable living users to preserve themselves for future generations. And sometimes it's the same system that is enabling both of these options, but sometimes they're distinct products. And both come with different kinds of issues and questions. The biggest distinction has to do with consent. So this is one of the central elements that my work with my colleague at Cambridge, Kasia Nowaczek-Basińska, foregrounds, this question of consent when it comes to these systems, and the distinction between a legacy-focused application and a grief-focused application obviously has to do with the fact that the former is designed or created with the person who's trying to immortalize themselves. The other is not. So there is this question of whether this person's data and all the information that someone who wants to interact with a grief bot is inputting into the system is done according with this deceased person's wishes. So again, consent is definitely one of the key concerns that we had. Very often when so on the one hand we could be talking about the consent of the person who's being immortalized, quote unquote. But what we tried to center in our research was also the other question of so this is what we refer to as mutual consent, the fact that we also need to very carefully think about the consent of the people who are meant to interact with the product. So we could imagine a situation where, let's say, I want to preserve myself for my family members, and I just and eventually I die, and that's when they receive invitations to interact with me in this new format, AI-enabled format. And while some of my family members might be happy about it, excited, interested, some might not be. So how do we make sure that both um, both people who are meant to interact with the product, but also those who power the product in some sense, are really consenting to the nature of the interaction, the nature of the relationship enabled by deadbots. So that's just like one of the many areas of concerns that we highlighted in our work with Kasia. But I'm happy to speak to more if you want me to.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I remember watching a documentary recently with the founder of Replica AI was talking. And Replica AI came about because one of her best friends passed away, and so she sort of scraped all the
Yeah.
information, put it on him, recordings, etc., and then created a dead bot based on that information. But obviously without his explicit consent, because he died before she started doing that. So I mean, are there legalities around copyright or ownership of information? So in terms of, if I passed away, could you legally create a dead bot of me, but without necessarily my wife and children's permission? Where does it stand from a legal standpoint?
I should say, which is kind of obvious from the description of my work at the beginning, I'm not a legal scholar. So,
You're not a lawyer. No, that's fine.
and I should also say that it really depends on the jurisdiction. So
Yeah, of
there are
course.
different approaches in the U.S. It might be quite different from
Mhm.
what's happening in Germany, for instance.
Mhm.
But bearing this in mind, the reality is that there are two questions here. One is what happens with the data that is already sitting somewhere within the digital
Yeah.
sort of public sphere.
Mhm.
So what happens to our public posts on social media? So that's one question, but it's quite separate from what if I send letters to someone, like physical letters, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's windy in Paris, which is good
Mhm.
because it's not as warm, but you can see
Mhm.
the flow of air. Anyway, so this is quite separate from this question of how do we handle essentially archival material, right? And so it's not like this is not a completely new question. There are already standards for handling private letters sent to people. So, is it really fundamentally a new question compared to, let's say, publishing someone's letters after they die without their consent? And we have multiple examples in history of literature of this being
Yeah.
done. Same thing happened with multiple diaries. Another question of whether this is consensual or not, and what the ethics of these kinds of decision is. It's not a new question. So I think it's also worth bearing in mind that not all of it is completely new. Not all of it is a completely new legal question. But then the data that you use to feed a system is one thing, and then what happens with the emerging simulation is a distinct question. So who owns that simulation is really new. And I've heard actually different kinds of responses to this question from legal scholars who do work on this more directly. And what I find most interesting and encouraging is actually that companies that offer these services also started thinking more carefully about this question of ownership. Both in the sense that there are more and more companies that only allow the production uh, of digital doubles, essentially, of people who are directly consenting to this being done
Okay.
with their data. That's the first thing that I've observed, and the second is is this question of ownership, that companies are, more and more companies are more consciously thinking of this question of how to govern the existence of such a simulation after a person, the original person, is no longer there to manage that representation. So I would say that, and this, this is a governance question of, on the one hand, I think we should be thinking about regulation, so hard law. But in many ways, I think the most interesting things right now are happening within this sphere of self-governance by companies, and what they are trying to propose to solve some of the issues that we are already aware of as critical when it comes to this specific space.
Stepping away a little bit from the technical aspects of deadbots for a moment, how have you experienced people's emotional connection with the deadbots? And talk to different people, hear different things. Some people connect with it very comfortably, and almost assumes the position of their parent, their child, their sibling, etc. And they talk to it and have a communication with it, and it's a relationship, if you want to call it that, or at least an interaction. Yeah, I guess is there a concern that it almost goes too far, and that people start to emerge memories that they have of in real life interactions with the person, with memories that they are creating with the facsimile or digital twin or deadbot of the person? How are people emotionally able to cope with that?
We start to see some empirical research that analyzes that impact, that direct impact on people who decided to use deadbots over a period of time.
Mhm.
And there's there's more and more evidence of that, and evidence of the fact that actually, it's not so easy to assume that the impact is negative.
Yeah.
That is to say, people that turn to deadbots to resolve some personal issues related to a person's passing seem to be experiencing that interaction in a positive way. And the other interesting thing that we are learning from more and more studies is that the satisfaction from the interaction is not necessarily directly correlated to the accuracy of the representation of that person. So that gives us some indication of what the impact on people could be. The people who are directly willingly using these systems. But I think, and while this is interesting, and I mean, we need more empirical evidence because these studies are very limited, they usually focus on very, very small groups of participants.
Yeah.
We actually need to think much more about the impact on people who are not directly using these systems, A, and B, people who do not want to use these systems, right? So this is something that I'm thinking about a lot in my work. This the impact of a particular system on a community, not just in an individual user. So even if one person is very satisfied with with their interaction with let's say a postmortem avatar of their father, the fact that the avatar of that person exists in the first place might have some sort of impact on this person's sibling or their partner or their grandson, etc., grandchild. So it's really about, for me, it's really trying to surface these less direct impacts of these systems, and not only focusing on the people who are. So long story short, the studies that we have, because they are primarily focusing on people who are willingly using these systems, tend to be more positive in some sense, right?
Yes.
But we need to understand the impact on people who, A, do not directly use these systems, but are still impacted by this system's existence, and the wider community impacts or social impacts that are much harder to measure, actually, through a survey or whatever tools that that we have to study these broader impacted scale.
That's super interesting. I was just thinking about a real life example. So both my parents passed away in the last couple of years. And when I sort of thought about it at the time, I thought, I can't imagine that. That'd be terrible. I can't imagine anything worse. But as time's gone on, I really wish I could pick up the phone, interact with some sort of device, and talk to my dad or mum and say, "Oh, just to let you know, Alexander, my son's passed his driving test, or he's passed his exams, or whatever." And like I say, I wouldn't necessarily need some huge response back from them, just to hear their voice saying, "Oh,
Yeah.
no, we're so proud of it. That's really wonderful." That yeah, as I've got slightly older, I think that really does feel like something that I really really like. But my sibling, absolutely not. So there is, I think, so I have this continued relationship with my parents and my siblings. Relationship finished when they died. So yeah, and I haven't seen the studies, as you said, look at the impact on people that haven't chosen to be part of this dynamic, but nonetheless are impacted by the fact that dynamic exists at all. So yeah, that's really interesting to think about that broader context. And like I say, beyond the family, beyond friendship groups, beyond community groups, all those things that are impacted by, but not directly involved with. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, and you touched on this already, is around, what's the right word to put it? The sort of retiring or decommissioning of deadbots. So I used to have this fear that, gosh, you'd sign up for this program, you pay your $50 a month or whatever, and then the company goes out of business, and then that product is lost. It doesn't exist anymore, or they put the price up to $500 a month. You can't access, or you think, well, gosh, at some point, I've got what I want to get from this, but if I turn it off, is it almost like
Yeah.
turning my parents off again? So is there such a thing as a, yeah, how thoughtful are we currently being about the termination of the deadbot that we've spent all this time lovingly creating and connecting with?
Yeah, so there are actually several layers to this. The first one is, let's say you created a representation, or someone created a representation of themselves for you, and at some point you feel like you've had enough. Like actually you don't want to continue the interaction, but you also don't want that representation to exist somewhere in the digital space where no one is sort of taking care of that
Yeah.
representation anymore. You don't want that representation or simulation to be abandoned essentially, and
Mhm.
you want to retire that specific postmortem avatar. So indeed what we suggested in that very first article that we published a couple of years ago now, with Kasia, is that companies should be aware of the fact that it might be the case that some people at a certain point will want to say goodbye to that representation, and they need to think, the designers, they need to think about how to enable people to say goodbye to these simulations in a meaningful and sensitive way. And that's the first layer. And you could be thinking about it in different ways. And indeed, there are some designers and design scholars that are thinking about how to say goodbye to not only representations of deceased loved ones, but actually chatbots in general, right? Because we see more and more people developing new forms of relationships with chatbots, as
Yeah.
friends, as lovers, as advisors, and any relationship can end at a certain point, and thinking about how that end looks like or what it should look like in the context of chatbots is quite a central design question of our time right now. So that's the first layer, but then the second one that you already pointed to is this question of what happens if the company doesn't survive? How do you make sure that there is a process in place for what should happen with the data collected by the company that is representative of a specific person, and what happens to the simulation itself? How can we make sure that, given the dynamics of the market, actually people who want their representation to persist can achieve that. So that's the sort of second layer of this question of retirement. But the third one that I find to be actually central but not as discussed is the need for planned obsolescence of these systems. So this is, of course, fundamentally in contradiction with the idea of digital immortality, something that is meant to last forever. But this is another point that we make with my colleague Kasia in a different article that is not out yet, where essentially we're saying that because not only of individual but also sort of and social but also environmental for environmental reasons, we should consider uh, an end date to any avatar, because we can imagine how over a number of years the accumulation of the data and the simulations would actually have a pretty high environmental cost. And the so that's, the environmental cost of this maintenance is one a question that we should be asking ourselves. But the other one is the emotional cost of exposing future generations to more and more and more digital data and digital representations of people, and eventually these future generations having to make decisions about which avatars to maintain, which to retire, and why. So when we start to design these systems, we should be actually thinking about what we would like to happen to essentially these personal narratives in the grand scheme of things in the future. And I think that's a matter of responsibility on the part of both providers but also users of these technologies.
It's just so interesting how much things have changed in the last, I don't know, 150 years, whatever. I mean, obviously there's no, I don't think any photographs exist of my well, certainly my great great grandparents. One of my great grandparents. There might be one or two photographs of my grandparents. There's a few more because they might have died sort of 20, 30 years ago, so there's more. But photographs that I had when I was growing up, there might be the school photograph, couple on holiday, 20 a year. My kids, sort of 19 and 16 now. I think for Madeline, our daughter, I think we had 10,000 in the first year. They're all digitally stored somewhere, so yeah, and then means obviously there was photographs, then there was cine film, then video film, then smartphones, then social media. So there's so much more physical digital data available about our loved ones now than. But 100 years ago we didn't have. All we ever had was the memory of, I know his name, I know what he used to do for a job, I know who his kids were. That's pretty much the memory I have of that person. So do you think the increased digitization of people, whether in deadbots or not, does that affect the memories that we have of them?
It definitely affects the way we create narratives of ourselves thanks to these technologies, right? I actually so there are two sides here, and I haven't like really very well articulated thoughts on this, and I don't want to sound judgmental while making but while thinking about it live, but one thing that that is at the core of this question of how do we create grief bots or dead bots, postmortem avatars, is the question of curation. So we all select the kind of data, the kind of texts, images, videos that we think are either a good representation of that person that we want to quote unquote resurrect, or that we believe are a good representation of ourselves, if it is us who are designing these digital representation of ourselves for future generations or for our loved ones. And I think there is some tension here between accuracy and curation, and the fact that both we exist in different ways with different people. We are different people to different people, but also that different people will have very different visions of what the accurate version of us actually is. So so that's the one side of this question of curation, the question of accuracy, and the question of truthfulness. And again, we can think of how certain individuals might be using these tools in new ways to create new platforms for legacy building that actually, in some cases, might be problematic, especially when we're talking about individuals who have done a lot of harm to others during their lifetime, right? So that's sort of that's one side of this question of curation. On the other hand, though, and I find that very problematic for environmental reasons, is that there are more and more people who take pictures of themselves, videos, without any sense of limitation. It's sort of, they pay more for cloud storage and they're happy because finally they don't have to delete photos to make new ones. Um,
Yes.
so there is this question of abundance that actually potentially has no value to anyone, and even that person who's making the pictures will not have enough time in their lifetime to go through all the individual pictures. So, long story short, curation is at the core of this issue of preservation, obviously, and I don't think, and this is where it gets hard. I don't think we have a good script for this. I don't think we have actually a very good and sound framework to tell people this is what you should preserve and this is what you shouldn't be preserving. And in part because we don't want to end up in a situation where only people who are somehow sort of seen as socially relevant or politically relevant or historically relevant are the ones that get to be preserved in this new format, while others in their daily lives are not because they are not seen as worthy of preservation. So, but this is why I'm saying I don't have a very well articulated sort of script for this. I don't think I know what to say to people. You should be
Yeah.
preserving this or you shouldn't be preserving that. But it is something that I would encourage everyone, and this is where it does come in a certain way to individual responsibility, to really think about the environmental and social consequences of preserving too much. That's something I think we should all bear in mind when we're making decisions about what should happen with our stuff, including the digital stuff, after we die.
Yeah. There's a lot of people don't currently write in what happens to um, their digital content in their wills, and it doesn't, and it becomes there's lots. We've read lots of cases about social media companies refusing to take things down, refusing to publish things, refusing to access passwords and things. But there's so much in what you said then, and it's really interesting. You're talking about that that ability to just capture everything because we can just
Yeah.
always pay for more storage. I remember people listen to this might not remember this, but used to buy a film camera. You would buy a film. On the film, there were typically 24 or 36 shots you could take. You pay $5 for the film, $15 to get developed. So, and it was quite expensive for what you actually got. So you went on holiday, you had one roll of film. So you were limited to taking 36 photographs, typically during a 1 week holiday, whatever. So you were very, very mindful thought, and you couldn't check what a photograph looked like. You took the photograph, and you went to the chemist. You didn't know until 2 weeks later what the photograph was like.
Yeah.
So you were very, very mindful of the photographs you took, and people couldn't pull funny faces. They couldn't close their eyes. They couldn't blink. Whatever. You had to really, really be focused on the photographs you were taking. Whereas now, like I say, you can take 20 photographs of the same thing, and typically don't delete any of them. Just they're there. You ready to look at them again, and that's one challenge is that yeah we've lost the art of mindful curation because we don't need to. Then the other thing you said, and this is something that I guess from a dystopian science fiction perspective, do we potentially have in the future avatars, deadbots of two examples, Putin, Trump, that are they created and they carry on leading their party because it's the same. It's everything you ever said, it's everything you ever captured, everything you ever wrote, it's everything you ever thought. So it's not no different. Why do you need to vote for another president? Why can't Putin be sort of president for life? Because you're talking to him in essence, and that does feel quite science fictiony, but it doesn't feel beyond the realms of possibility. And
Yeah.
yeah, how do you manage for that scenario?
Um, so it's not actually as science fictiony as you would expect. We have seen examples of political leaders being resurrected, quote unquote, with AI to, well, for propaganda slash political communications reasons. We have seen examples in India, for instance, of this being done. Former party leaders, their images or simulations being used to encourage voters to vote for that party specifically. Um, but this you could really sort of put under this category of propaganda communications. Governance and actual power is a completely different question, but it's a very relevant one. I mean I don't expect or suspect that we are any way close to strong leaders trying to preserve themselves in this way and actually succeeding in in establishing a new political system where this is possible. But the reality of both political and economic activity of specific people who are no longer alive but preserve themselves in this new way is not speculative. I mean, it's possible. It's already happening. People are starting to consider how, for instance, like some of the conversations that I got to have about in this area around this specific question of political and economic activity after death. Some writers, including journalists, are starting to think about how we can, or how they can, sort of continue their creative activity in a way after death that would enable their families to continue benefiting very actively from their ability to produce text beyond the grave through their post-mortem representations. And then, that raises all kinds of questions, including where do we make space for new people, new voices? Is it a trade-off? I mean, maybe it's not really a trade-off, but it could be. Um, so, so I don't think the question that you're asking is as speculative as it might seem at first glance.
Well, you can think of lots of scenarios where, I mean, there's obviously lots of economic sort of challenges around the world. So almost having the ability to go back and ask an Adam Smith or a preeminent
Mm,
economist from 100 years ago, we feed all their writings, all their knowledge, all the thing into a platform and ask them what they think should happen. It's all quite tempting to us. Yeah, and I found a silly app the other day where, from a philosophy point of view, I could talk to Socrates. Thankfully, not in ancient
yeah.
Greek. He was speaking English, which is great. But again, somebody's uploaded all his writings and things, and it was very basic. But it was still, I was asking questions. It was responding to me in a way that perhaps Socrates probably wouldn't have at all. But in the way it was framed and things. So this thing's, yeah. I think from a novelty point of view, it's quite fun. But from a slightly more concerning point of view, it does raise many more questions than we can possibly answer. But just stepping on from,
Yeah.
so we've talked about grief bots. So a little bit about potentially what happens when people want to represent themselves after they pass and what that looks like. But one of the big things we've seen in the UK now, I'm sure lots of other countries, is I think the UK government now are looking at their 27th attempt to revise social care. Social care is obviously a big
Mm,
issue. We have free care at point of need and NHS, but social care we have to pay for. And one of the big things we have here in the UK and lots of countries is more and more single person households, more and more loneliness, potential limited access to somebody to talk to, really. And some people would moot AI companions as potentially being I won't use the word solution, potentially being something that could be useful in that context. And I wonder what your thoughts were around trying to mitigate loneliness
mm,
via AI companions. And just extend the question even more, because some of the pushback I get when I talk to people about it is that if we allow AI companions into people's lives, it's going to stop them seeking out real people to go and talk to, and therefore is going to mitigate loneliness. My view is that if somebody's been living on their own for 10 years, their partner died 20 years ago, their kids live 500 miles away, they've never seen anybody from day to day apart from when they go shopping, surely it's a good thing to have something slash somebody to talk to. Why would that be a bad thing? And I just wondered, yeah, what your take was
mm.
on.
Well, I mean, the example that you just gave actually is a reminder that it's so, so hard to speak in these broad terms about, any of these technologies, any of these uh, bigger questions just without referring to very specific contexts and very specific scenarios or very specific real life situations. And then that makes actually, critical design is indeed a way of encouraging us to think about context very, very consciously. Um, and so yes, I mean, actually, in some sense, I would agree with you that that it's hard to say that the impact on a person who's already isolated for various reasons that are material. They're not just psychological, actually. They are isolated because they are not as mobile as they used to be.
Yep.
Maybe they're disabled. So in that sense, I agree. Actually, as a matter of self-help, I would not ever say to anyone that they shouldn't be using it because it can harm them. It's just too, yeah. However, what I would say is that governments looking into AI as a solution to these broad societal problems is a completely different. So this is just to say these are two different conversations. A
Yeah.
person looking for help in a particular scenario where it's justifiable because they have no other options is one thing, and that's a very specific kind of situation. And we could be thinking about what we could be providing. By we, I mean both companies and academics, as well as governments potentially. What we could be providing people with to ensure that their interactions are healthier, safer, that they do not lead to further exclusion. That's sort of one thing that we could be discussing. But then to think about AI as a solution to some of these issues that are very systemic, very broad. They're not individual based at all. Loneliness is one of these issues. These bigger societal challenges is a separate conversation, and I think we need to always separate the two. And if I were to advise governments, I would say no, 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 no. This is not the way to resolve loneliness. To just invest into private AI companies that provide senior citizens in a given region with chatbots or robots. It's just not enough, essentially. And the scary thing is that we have seen actually the New York State did this precise thing. They partner up with providers of LEQ, a device that functions both as a chatbot, but also in some other ways. I can say a little bit more about LEQ in a second. But this happened, I think, 3 years ago already. That so local governments, and I'm sure other governments, national governments also, will be thinking more and more about solving these big issues with simple technological interventions. And I think this we should be opposing quite radically. We need to push the state to resolve these some of these issues with the degree of complexity that the challenges require, and loneliness is definitely one of them.
Just this, as you're saying there, just slightly playing devil's advocate for the government's role in this. If the government was to install a sort of a physical representation of a chatbot in everybody's home, and that chatbot spoke to you in the morning and said, "Look, Andrew, don't forget to take your heart medication. Andrew, I don't think you've eaten vegetables this week. You should be eating more vegetables. Andrew, just scanning your fridge, I notice there's no fresh fruit and veg in there. Andrew, just..." So, is there a case that perhaps it could enhance somebody's quality of life by asking those prompting, measuring, guiding questions?
This comes down to um, this tension between, is something better than nothing, right? Is something
Yeah,
better than nothing?
yeah,
And honestly, again, it's so context specific. It's very hard to say it's better, or it depends on like what kind of system are we talking about? Is it a publicly produced system that has a very good data governance strategy that ensure, because the systems that we are seeing on the market right now that try to tap into this loneliness epidemic question as a, I mean, as a business opportunity, right?
yeah.
What we see is, for instance, a system that you can buy for your parent, older, or any senior in your family, so that they can interact with the chatbot that supposedly monitors their cognitive abilities on continuously and flags up if there is anything potentially wrong happening, so you can intervene. So this again, coming back to that question that we started with of empowerment, this is not about empowering the senior citizen, the older
Yeah.
person, the lonely person. It's about introducing a new monitoring device for the person who should be taking care of that older person. I'm not saying that the realities of care are easy, and that companies should not be thinking of providing tools that might enable carers to care for the people they love in more bearable ways. So again, this always requires a degree of complexity when we're trying to make judgments about these situations. But essentially, what I'm saying is that there is a big difference between a system that I have just mentioned and between a system that is provided by the state in some way or form, that is designed not to make profit out of someone's suffering. And I think that's, with grief bots that we dedicated a huge chunk of our conversation to, we have seen experiments that I can see that the people behind these systems are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to produce systems that do not harm people. But I have also seen systems that, well, of course, no one is actively trying to harm anyone, at least explicitly. But I have seen, for instance, companies that very actively argue that their systems could be used by children, and especially in cases where the parents are no longer alive. It could be a beneficial thing for the child. I mean, there are so many issues related to that. But long story short, this is what I would caution against. Scenarios in which corporate profit really determines the way a technology is designed, and especially when it comes to such a socially charged and such and a complex issues such as care and systems of care and this question of loneliness. I mean, we just should be very critical of how this is being done and by whom. But again, this is not a blanket sort of. It's just not to say it shouldn't be done, but it is to say that if it is to happen, it has to be done in a very explicitly non-profit driven way. Maybe that's a better
No,
way to put it.
that's a really good way to put it. And I think is that, as you were saying, it almost feels that at some point, if these chatbots, companion bots existed, then it's almost like if you're a child or a sibling who lives 200 miles away and feel frustrated about going every Sunday to see your parents or whatever, every week or whatever the situation is, you're almost outsourcing responsibility to the well they've got the companion bot, so they don't need me in the same way. And I can imagine for the almost for the entry level service, it comes and it has adverts in it, and have you eaten your soup today? Don't forget Campbell's soup is the best soup there is, and you can almost imagine it becomes a commercial element to it.
Yeah.
It's yeah, yeah. Um, so you chair Caping, which is a policy group developing guidelines for socially beneficial AI companions. How it feels literally like trying to keep the tide at bay. How do you create guidelines that you believe people will adhere to?
Um, yeah, that is a very good question. I think by building alliances between different groups of actors, both within and outside of the technology industry, between academia and policy, and I think that group is I mean, it's a very small group of around 20 people, coming from both industry and some professional bodies as well, such as the IEEE, and yeah, so the result of this work is yet to come out, and I think it will very soon, actually, probably by the end of the summer, a report focusing specifically on the question of consent and AI companions. So we decided to focus on consent as a central question for the first iteration of this
Yeah.
group's work. And so, um, actually coming back to critical design, one of the questions that critical designers could be asking themselves or should be asking themselves is, how do I make sure that the user of the technology is engaging critically with what they're interacting with, right? And so the idea of recurring consent is one of these mechanisms that could potentially lead precisely to this. So the idea that when you're engaging with a technology, you do not consent to interacting with it only once before you start the interaction, but actually that you're asked to reconsent throughout the interaction. So essentially, the reason why I link it to critical design is that critical design sees interruption or friction as potentially positive or productive when it comes to design, even if design more broadly actually aims towards user friendliness, smoothness, invisibility of design actually. So the point here is that sometimes making design visible and interruptive in some sense can be desirable, and bringing it down to this question of consent and the fact that maybe users need to be re-asked for consent, especially as circumstances change, and especially when it comes to systems that are general purpose. So maybe you think of, let's say, ChatGPT as a tool for editing texts, but when ChatGPT all of a sudden turns into a personal life, life advisor, that's a very different functionality that you're tapping into, and maybe you should be made aware of that while you're using a system. That there is a new dimension to it that you're unlocking in some sense. So, and maybe to make sure that you understand what you're doing, you need to be provided with a little bit more information, but also essentially re-asked if you are actually okay with that system taking on that role in that given instance. Again, I mean, the result of this work will come out in a couple of weeks, but it was actually very encouraging to see how there was a lot of alignment on the need for these different mechanisms for eliciting consent, as well as alignment on what meaningful consent in this specific case could mean, as well as a pretty strong consensus over the fact that consent is not ever going to guarantee that the use of a specific technology is ethical or that it's not harmful. So while we decided to focus on consent, and we are suggesting in that report that will come out from this work in a couple of weeks, we are suggesting very specific instructions for how you could be reforming consent elicitation mechanisms for your specific system product to ensure that they're more carefully designed, more thoughtful, more meaningful. We also make it clear that this is not the only thing that companies should be doing to make sure that the use of, in particular, AI companions or emotionally effective systems, that it's safe and responsible.
I very much like the idea of consent not being a one and done. Which I think, because all of us will we'll take to say read the terms and conditions of the sort of 200-page document. Hidden somewhere on page 197, it'll say we have the rights to store, capture, use, commercialize your data as ever we see fit. But I think having, because we obviously have the ability now within the systems to bring that consent awareness in real time. So, like I say, when I'm shifting from ChatGPT edits my document, now I'm using it to create a bot facsimile of myself or whatever else. It's are you aware that this is ... And it comes because yes, I'm using the same tool, but in a very, very different way. And I think that's something that I haven't heard before, and I think that's really important. I think that whole thing about consent is a continuous element that we should, and because we absolutely have the ability now. It's not like we signed a written document. We've got this thing that updates all the time, and we don't know that version 4 versus version 5. We've only given one consent to the first version, where we don't know the fifth version is so much more powerful, but uses so much more electricity, so much more water, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's super. I really look forward to reading that. That's super interesting. And then you've given me a lot of time already. I don't want to take your whole day. You need to go find somewhere cool to sit and have a nice cool drink. But I did want to touch on something else. You do a lot of work with, for want of a better phrase, AI literacy for journalists and on intercultural perceptions. And one of the things I guess AI potentially has exacerbated is that, well, a lot of AI has been developed and has been taught and has learned based on Western civilization, Northern Hemisphere, inputs, etc., and potentially it's widening the gap that we have between cultures and between different countries. And how do you what would you like journalists, communicators, writers, authors to be sensitive to when talking about AI and AI usage and AI benefits, etc.?
Uh, well, okay. Thanks for asking this, and I'll just start by saying, as I mentioned when before we started recording, It seems like I'm very intellectually promiscuous, working on grief bots, AI companions, and then
See,
journalism.
okay.
But fundament. I mean, for me, fundamentally, critical design is that glue
Yeah,
for all of it, and my interest in this question of how people who are not working in the technology industry get to be informed by journalists and other storytellers about what it is that they're interacting with is actually directly relevant to the question of critical design, in the sense that it comes down to thinking about ways in which people are informed and in which they should be informed about what it is that they're doing and how they're interacting with specific systems, and therefore also how access to information, as well as the encouragement to imagine our own desirable futures, is a matter of empowerment. So thinking about narratives in general is very directly tied to this question of critical design, and the argument that could be made that we're all designers in different ways. We design our daily lives, we design small technologies, we design our small tweaks to specific systems so that they work for us better. So it's about recognizing that each of us has the right to make systems work for us. And that does directly link to the question of how do we get to see technologies as either fixed and predetermined by a different set of actors, um, powerful actors in the global north, mostly in the Anglophone West, primarily in the US, and to what extent we can still imagine a world in which these technologies can actually work for us, not for this specific group of influential people in a very specific part of the world. So that's why the interest in journalism and communications is actually linked to this question of how we design technologies more critically. And my main sort of I mean, you asked about like a specific, we could say, a recommendation for communicators, and I would say is really about right now. It's essential that we present the development of AI as not yet predetermined. So it's not something that has already been decided on. That it is still something that we should want to shape. And this can be through political pressure. This could be also through refusal to use specific systems in particular contexts. It's also about organizing in the workplace. If a given employer is pushing for, again, I mean, the use of of specific tools to seemingly increase productivity, although the value of specific tools and specific work settings is yet to be proven. Really, I mean, that there is contradictory evidence to regarding the scale of the improvement, quote unquote. So this is just to say that yeah, I think too many journalists, unfortunately, and this is partly because AI is now everywhere. It touches all areas of life and all industries, and people who are not specialized in technology reporting are all of a sudden tasked with reporting on specific new interventions related to their domain. Could be medicine, for instance, could be education, and because they lack training on what AI is, how it operates, not just as a technology, but as a socioeconomic socioeconomic and political mega system. They lack training to see AI for what it is in some instances. And so what they end up doing is really perpetuating narratives put forward by technology companies' PR teams. And that is, I think, one of the issues that I have with how some journalists report on AI. But it's not necessarily their fault, and this I know because I have done a lot of work with journalists, with different journalism communities, unions as well. And I mean, this is again not an individual fault or something that individuals can fix, but it's definitely some. So it is a systemic issue again. Um, but because not all journalists have enough time to educate themselves about all of the things AI that obviously keep popping up every day. Um, so this is partly why at Cambridge we put together this AI and responsible journalism toolkit to provide journalists with a hub where they can easily access information depending on the level of familiarity with AI systems, so they can actually do this more meaningfully, responsibly, um, and even if they're not specializing in technology reporting.
I know that is so important, and we've had instances in the last few weeks where obviously you look at the headlines, and there's a headline recently. There's an open AI agent that, depending on who you read, it escaped into the internet,
Yeah,
hacks major tech firm without any human intervention. It's like, oh my goodness, but AI is just in the internet now. It's escaped. The headline was AI has escaped, and it was just,
yeah,
it was almost the AI is a physical entity in the first place. It's escaped from this sandbox that it was in, if the journalist even got that far. But no, it's on the internet now, and it's hacking what it wants to, and it's oh my goodness, the headlines are terrifying. I mean, you actually read like 2 weeks later, people's actual detailed account of what really happened. But then we know the news moves on so quickly that people just see those headlines, which it's irresponsible. It's not a good representation of where AI is going to. So that anything that helps people think, be a bit more mindful about the information they're putting out into the public domain. For people that aren't using AI,
yeah.
for my parents, for my siblings, for my colleagues, whatever, that aren't using AI in the same way that I use it or you use it, it's what they read. They read the headlines of the newspaper, and that's what they see and what they believe, I guess.
Mm.
So my final question, and I could easily go on for another few hours, but I do want to give you some of your day back. So you've already covered so many areas. You obviously have an important paper coming out soon, in Paris. So is it possible to say what your focus areas are going to be in the future? And as an add-on to that, do you think there are critical aspects of our interaction with AI that we're not currently researching, talking about, that we should be?
Um, Yeah, there are maybe several things I could mention. One, actually, very briefly coming back to this question of toolkits. So, I mentioned the AI and journalism toolkit. There is another
Yeah.
one that we produce at Cambridge called HEAT, the High Risk U AI Act toolkit, um, that essentially allows people to follow the requirements put forward by the AI Act. So, a comprehensive piece of regulation focused on AI produced by, well, coming from the European Union, um, but also doing more than just that, encouraging people to actually adopt the most up-to-date, ethical, critical development standards as well. And I'm saying this just because when you're asking me about future priorities, I would say that I will continue to think about how, and this is fundamental to critical design as a way of thinking about design. It's not just about critiquing design; it's about producing in a different way, proposing alternatives. So I think that is quite fundamental to my work in general. That the idea that it's important to see what could go wrong, but it is also important to actually suggest what we could be doing differently. It's about cultivating that ability to imagine things differently, either very radical changes, systemic changes that are more utopian and more difficult to achieve, as a matter of orienting ourselves towards something, but also actually thinking about these small fixes that can, in one way or another, be a starting point for bigger changes. Recurring consent that I mentioned could be one of these small changes. So I will continue to think about this dynamic, actually, how we can provide uh, designers, people, professionals, journalists, and others, including civil society. That's the other thing that I did a lot of working with civil society organizations and thinking about how they can be empowered to more actively participate in AI governance discussions. So I will continue doing this. So this is like a very broad stroke kind of description of what I'll be doing, and more specifically, I'm really interested in the impact of new forms of AI companions, including AI companions as live advisors. Um, the impact of these systems not only on individuals but on communities. So something I mentioned earlier, and we have
Yeah.
we have pretty good methods for understanding the impact on individuals by now. So you know, both from human-computer interaction, but also from psychology. Obviously, there are methods for studying this, but I think we need to think of new ways of studying the ways in which a specific system could be impacting a broader environment in which a person is entangled. Um, and so I with two colleagues at Cambridge, Eleanor Drage and Dorian Peters, we are starting a new initiative, the Digital Wellbeing Observatory at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. So it's an observatory within a center within the university, which will actually try to achieve precisely this: develop new methods for studying the impact on communities, but also um, learning from field work what ideas for more desirable technology uses people already have, because there's the other thing that we know: people who are not technology experts negotiate their own relationships with technology companies and technology systems in their everyday lives, and they have
Yeah.
ideas for how things could be done and how they could work differently. And I think that's what we will try to surface in a more systematic way, and then think how we can turn these insights into recommendations, both for the industry but also for government. So yeah, long story short, this is what I will be working on in the next 5 years or so. The project has just started.
That was my last question. My final question must be: do you ever sleep?
I don't sleep much, but
Okay.
I will. I maybe I should use one of these apps. Maybe I should have a companion monitoring my sleep and reminding me to take
Yeah,
a nap
absolutely.
once in a while. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's absolutely fascinating talking to you.
Thank you so much.
I love the academic promiscuity and just curiosity that you obviously have. It's just inspiring. So no, thank you so much. And enjoy the weather in Paris. And try not to get too hot. And yeah, it's really been really good to spend some time with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the questions, and I'm really glad that we covered so much. Actually, that's very I'm very grateful, and I hope you feel better soon. Also,
Yeah, this silly summer cold. Hopefully it goes away. I'll go get some cold and flu in a minute. But no, thank you.
all right.
Cool.